Hi, I'm Michael Noll. Many of you probably know me from my days as program director of the Writers League of Texas. Now I'm coming to you from New Mexico, my new home up in the mountains, which is not a bad place to be self-isolated during a pandemic crisis because I'm surrounded by mountains. I'm talking to you today about finding the voice in your mystery novel. Before I start talking about that, though, I want to say just one thing about the pandemic crisis as it relates to writers, because I follow a lot of writers on social media. I've seen all the different posts about this is a great opportunity to write your novel, to get a bunch of work done, or like they tell stories about past sort of like social shutdowns. Yeah, that's right. Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. And you think, well, that's great to hear. If he did it, so can I. Also, that raises the bar pretty high because you have to think, wow, he wrote that. What am I doing? And so I would say it is true that you probably have more time now, although that's not necessarily true if you've got kids or family that you're taking care of, or you're worried about trying to have money or groceries or toilet paper or whatever. Like, you should not add the extra stress of feeling like you must write or that you must get a certain number of pages a day. That is just if there's anything we don't need right now, it's more stress. And it's certainly true that like, this is a crazy stressful time. We have no idea what is going to come even next week. And so, if you feel moved to write, then write. If you don't, then don't. Odds are we're in this for a while. Like, there's going to be an opportunity to write later on. What I would say is try to find some good books to read, because reading is always good. It's a great way to take your mind off, the rest of the world. But also, it can, like, reading inspires your writing, and so don't just read, but read the books that you really, really want to read. Don't, I mean, Amazon's not even sending books right now, so you can't get like the latest, most critically acclaimed bestseller. Just read whatever book that you've always wanted to read that's laying around, or that you can somehow get via ebook. Anyway, that's what I've been doing, because and that sort of leads into my presentation. I have been thinking about writing a mystery novel for some time, and I've kind of played around with it in the past, and I've got a particular idea that I want to play with. But I'm not really sure yet how to go about it. I mean, I know the plot and the story and the characters and setting. I know all that stuff, right? And because I read mystery novels, I know the kind of genre, I know the conventions, right? I know the kind of twists that tend to come up. I know the plot mechanisms, but those aren't really what make a mystery series. Instead, it is the voice. Like, most series especially become they're really more character studies than they are plot vehicles, because especially later on in any kind of like long series, whether it's by Sue Grafton or Joe Lansdale or anybody, they tend to be like about the drama. Like, the first parts of the novels are all about the drama that the characters are engaged in their lives, and then later on, there has to be a plot, so the plot kicks in, and there's a crime, but what we're really reading for is the characters and the voices. And so that's what, for me, drives the novel, and that's what I'm trying to figure out. How do I tell the story that I want to tell in both the most effective way, but also the way that is most interesting, that is most appealing to me, that I'm most drawn to? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to take, if you're familiar with my kind of like teaching style, I'm going to take one-page excerpts. They're all from the first page of some novels that I've been reading recently, or at least two that are forthcoming. And I'm going to talk about how they work. Like, how does the author create the voice that then is going to drive the entire novel and in some cases a series forward. So without further ado, a couple of things to keep in mind that a first page of any novel needs to do, but it's particularly important in a mystery or crime novel that these things happen right away, in part because it's the convention. So you have to start the story. And by story, I mean plot, right? You need to, that's why there tends to be dead bodies, in the first couple of pages of mystery novels. That's just like, you need to get the story moving. You also need to introduce the important characters. And that might be, sort of the hero or the detective. It might be the villain. It might be the victim. It doesn't really matter as long as it's an important character. You don't want to start with a character that nobody cares about later on in the novel. Start with the meat. And then introduce the setting. And if you're familiar with mystery novels, you know that setting is crucially important. You cannot separate Joe Lansdale's Hap and Leonard series from East Texas. You cannot separate a series that I loved when I was a kid, the Cadfael mystery series about a 12th century English monk. You can't separate those from 12th century England. You just can't. I also remember, as a very young kid reading, of course, Hardy Boys, and now my kids, this break is basically brought to you, sponsored by the Hardy Boys audiobooks. And you cannot separate the Hardy Boys from 1950s square sort of man in the plaids, the man in the suit kind of aesthetic. And the same thing with I've read Father Brown mysteries, I read Agatha Christie, I read Sherlock Holmes, of course. You cannot separate those series from the settings. And so setting is very important in terms of creating your characters and in your voice. So you have these things that you have to do. And how do I feel about prologues? Sometimes you'll hear people sort of give very strong advice about prologues. Do them, don't do them. I mean, I think the rule with any kind of fiction is you do it if it works. And so, in terms of mystery novels, prologues, when they exist, tend to be from the victim's point of view. Here's so-and-so walking down the street, and then they end up dead. And then we jump forward to the protagonist, who's usually the detective. It just has to feel like it's serving the story. And if you can cut it and you don't need it, then you don't need it. So write one. If it works, great. And if it doesn't, cut it. And in terms of how do you create voice in doing the things that you have to do on a first page, I like to think of it as color commentary. If you're familiar with watching sports, most sports broadcasts have two broadcasters, the play-by-play person who says what's going on, and the color commentator who kind of gives the flair and the texture to the broadcast. And in football, so Rogers League of Texas is a big football state, right? Former Dallas Cowboys quarterback Tony Romo is one of my favorite color commentators, because he diagrams plays and talks about why they work or don't work, which is different than what happened. It's why it happened, how it happened. And he's critical of some players. He's complimentary of others. He tells stories about playing with different players. He adds he adds the color. He adds what's interesting, because we can all watch the game and see what is happening. But you can't, what the color commentator does is offer something that you cannot see, that only they can see. And every color commentator does it differently. Another Dallas Cowboys quarterback, Troy Aikman, is a very different commentator than Tony Romo. And so what you want to think about then is the voice of your novel, which may or may not sort of be tied to a particular character. What does it add to the story that the reader cannot figure out for him or herself? So the first book that I want to talk about is the first novel in Craig Johnson's Longmire series. I heard about this because my dad has been watching it on TV. It's as the little like sticker on the book, shows you. It's an A&E series. It's very, very popular. My dad has been telling me about it for a couple of years. And then my uncle told him, well, if you love this series, you should read the books. They're so much better. And so that's what he got for Christmas. It was a couple of books. And then I started reading them. They are in sort of, if you want to think about like the mystery and detective and crime genre as having lots of different sort of variations, this is pretty standard genre mystery stuff. It's going to be the setup, the format. It's going to be like other long-term series, because at this point there's like 15 books. It's going to be like other series you're familiar with, except it's set in, I believe, Wyoming, kind of rural Wyoming. And as you can tell from the cover, sort of very sort of Western aesthetic. And so it's going to be informed by that. It's quite good. If you're into just sort of like your down and dirty genre mystery stories, like these are excellent. And so here's the first page of the first book. And I want to think about how Craig Johnson does these things. Starts the story, introduces the characters and the setting in his own voice. I'm going to read this out loud and then we'll talk about it. All right, first page. Oh, and by the way, pandemic will make you resourceful. Pretty much all of my images of the text are from the Amazon preview. I just sort of did a snapshot of them. So that's what this is. You can, do the preview on Amazon and buy from your local indie. All right, first page. Bob Barnes says they got a dead body out on BLM land. He's on line 1. She might have knocked, but I didn't hear it because I was watching the geese. I watch the geese a lot in the fall when the days get shorter and the ice traces the rocky edges of Clear Creek. The sheriff's office in our county is in an old Carnegie building that my department inherited when the Absaroka County Library got so many books they had to go live somewhere else. We still got the painting of Andy out in the landing of the entryway. Every time the previous sheriff left the building, he used to salute the old robber baron. I've got the large office in the Southside Bay, which allows me an unobstructed view of the Bighorn Mountains to my right and the Powder River Valley to my left. The geese fly down the valley south with their backs to me, and I usually sit with my back to the window. But occasionally I get caught with my chair turned. This seems to be happening more and more lately. I looked at her, looking being one of my better law enforcement techniques. Ruby's a tall woman, slim, with a direct manner and clear blue eyes that tend to make people nervous. I like that in a receptionist dispatcher. Keeps the riffraff out of the office. She leaned against the door jamb and went to shorthand. Bob Barnes, dead body, line 1. I looked at the blinking red light on my desk and wondered vaguely if there was a way I could get out of this. Did he sound drunk? I am not aware that I've ever heard him sound sober. I flipped the file and pictures that I had been studying onto my chest and punched line 1 in the speakerphone button. Hey, Bob, what's up? Now, notice the story begins line 1. They got a dead body. And also, you get setting, line 1, BLM land, right? So if you're familiar with the West, lots of land is going to be BLM land or reservation land, which is also the case in this novel. There's a lot of public land or land that is sort of owned collectively. So that's very important. And so you get that. You also get, the sheriff, right? It's his voice. You get a sense of what he's really concerned about, which is tied to the setting, like the geese in the mountains. You also get one of the best parts of this for me is like the fact that the sheriff's office is in the old library. So it gives you a sense of the place, maybe the lack of resources or the way they make do, the small town feel of it. You get that, and then also you get his commentary. So you get I looked at her looking being one of my better law enforcement techniques. Like another detective would say that differently. That keeps the riffraff out of the office. Again, keeps it, it puts it in his particular voice. Anyway, next, I'm going to go to the next book, which is has a similar setting in a way, and a kind of similar story as a Craig Johnson novel, but goes about it in a very, very different kind of way. And so I want to point out that similar settings and stories don't necessarily have similar voices. There's the idiosyncrasies of, the characters. And there's also, in any kind of place, there's a wide variety of stories and people available to you as a writer. And so you don't have to feel like, well, I'm going to write a Western, so it needs to sound a particular kind of way, because there's a lot of options in the West. So the question then is, what details do you focus on? And this next novel, Ain't Nobody Nobody, is by Dallas writer Heather Harper Ellett. I suspect that some of you in the Writers League are familiar with her because she's taught a class, she's been at the conference, she's wonderful, her book is really doing well. It's set in East Texas. It's got kind of a country feel, like a Craig Longmire, or a Longmire novel, but it's very different. Here's her first page. Just before daybreak in the year of our Lord 1996, two of Randy Mayhill's hunting dogs cornered a wild hog, one dog backing it into a corner, one with his mouth clamped on its ear. Mayhill, still in his pajamas, boxer shorts, a holster, scrambled out of his tiny house to survey the commotion and then stabbed the hog behind its shoulder, killing it before it could see another sunrise. Mayhill grabbed its hind legs, dragged it onto a tarp set aside just for this purpose, and shooed the dogs away so they wouldn't wreck his prize. Then he went to work immediately on the hog, skinning it with a hunting knife, occasionally tearing off scrap pieces and throwing them on the porch for the hero dogs, because fair was fair. It was their kill. Still, he said aloud to nobody, they're my dogs. Even as he gutted the hog, blood up to his arms, smiling like a televangelist, Mayhill was aware that most men would have preferred to trap the hog and shoot it point blank, easy peasy. Mayhill approached life like hand-to-hand combat. Van had said that once. At the time, Mayhill had choked out a thank you, touched that his best friend had known him so well, until he realized that Van had meant it as a compliment. But the hog plague was hand-to-hand combat. The feral hog, Sus Scrofa, destroyer of crops and canines, it was war, an unwinnable one at that, and lesser men snapped. Cut Boudreaux poisoned them with antifreeze, but it killed all his deer and squirrels. Rudy Lyons went bankrupt on a fancy German trap he bought off the computer. One night, after they uprooted his forest of pine seedlings, Jimmy Kaysen stood on the front porch in full fatigues and mowed down a bunch of hogs with an AK-47 he bought out of a trunk of a Honda Civic in Dallas. And Jimmy Kaysen was the game warden. So this is great. I love this page. And again, it does the things that we needed to do. We get the setting, the time, year of our Lord 1996. We don't yet know that it's East Texas, but we can kind of guess because of the hogs, and there's a reference to Dallas, and it's rural for sure. We get Randy Mayhill, so it's not in his voice, it's a kind of third person narration, but there's a particular sort of like sound to the voice, which is always going to be the case even in third person. It's a community voice to some extent. And then we also get his perspective, though. Most men would have preferred to trap the hog and shoot it point blank, easy peasy. Mayhill approached life like hand-to-hand combat. We get that great line about him being criticized for that and thinking it's a compliment. And again, you're getting like sort of like a third person color commentary that gets inside his head. And then we get a sense of the community, the game warden mowing down hogs with an illegally bought AK-47. We don't yet have the crime, but we have murder. I mean, or hunting, however you want to sort of like, whatever you want to call it. But it's sort of it's tangential to the crime that's going to be, sort of show up very, very soon. And so we've got a sensibility of slaughter, and so that's gonna sort of play into the story, and it sets you up. And they're sort of like the characters' relationship to killing and blood and guts and butchering is going to play into like what is happening. So again, it's rural. It's got, a particular kind of character that would probably fit into a Craig Johnson novel, but the voice is completely different. Now, one of the things I love about the crime and detective genre is that it's not it is a genre, but it's also a storyline that transcends genre. So you will find, you'll find detective stories and mystery stories and crime stories in every genre: science fiction, fantasy, romance. Sherry Thomas is a really, really good mystery writer in Austin who started out in romance, and her mystery novels, a Lady Sherlock series, still has a kind of sensibility of a romance novel, but it's a mystery. So the question then is, if a storyline transcends genre, so if you can have a mystery story in any genre that you're writing, well, how does your genre handle it? Because a Sherry Thomas romance-influenced mystery is very different from an M. John Harrison, fantasy mystery, which is both sort of like space opera and informed by his own weird sensibility. So one of my very favorite books from the past few years has been the Murderbot series by Martha Wells. They're novellas, but she's got a full-length novel coming out in May. And it's very science fiction-y. I mean, it's about a bot and sort of like android, half human, half computer kind of being. It's set on planets. They travel through space. Like, this is straight up science fiction fantasy, but it is absolutely a mystery crime structure, as you will see from this first page, which is as good a first page as you will see. All right. I could have become a mass murderer after I hacked my governor module, but then I realized I could access the combined feed of entertainment channels carried on the company's satellites. It had been well over 35,000 hours or so since then, with still not much murdering, but probably, I don't know, a little under 35,000 hours of movies, serials, books, plays, and music consumed. As a heartless killing machine, I was a terrible failure. I was also doing my job on a new contract and hoping Dr. Valescu and Dr. Barajwaj finish their survey soon so we should get back to the habitat and I could watch episode 397 of Rise and Fall of Sanctuary Moon. I admit I was distracted. It was a boring contract so far, and I was thinking about backburnering the status alert channel and trying to access music on the entertainment feed without hub system logging the extra activity. It was trickier to do it in the field than it was in the habitat. This assessment zone was a barren stretch of coastal island with low flat hills rising and falling and thick greenish black grass up to my ankles. Not much in the way of flora or fauna, except a bunch of different sized bird-like things and some puffy floaty things that were harmless as far as we knew. The coast was dotted with big bare craters, one of which Barajwaj and Valescu were taking samples in. The planet had a ring, which from our current position dominated the horizon when he looked out to sea. I was looking at the sky and mentally poking at the feed when the bottom of the crater exploded. I didn't bother to make a verbal emergency call. I sent the visual feed from my field camera to Dr. Mince's and jumped down into the crater. As I scrambled down the sandy slope, I could already hear Mince over the emergency comm channel yelling at someone to get the hopper in the air now. They were about 10 kilos away working on another part of the island, so there was no way they were going to get here in time to help. So in terms of getting the story started, I mean, we have like an attack on the first page. We also get the character. We don't quite yet know what or who he is, except that he's got a job and he could have become a mass murderer, but he really wants to just watch TV. We get his voice. Like, as a heartless killing machine, I was a terrible failure. I just, this whole, series is filled with that sort of like wry, dry sense of humor. And of course, we get setting. We get the planet that they're on. And so, again, this is very science fiction-y. So we get like the stuff about backburnering the status alert channel. We get hub system and all the different kinds of things you would expect in science fiction. But we also, most importantly, get the voice of the character. And as an exercise, like, I can't think of a better sort of first paragraph to model like one of your own first paragraphs after. I could have become a mass murderer after I hacked my governor module. All right, so we have a kind of like big thing that happened in the character's past that brought them to the present. But then I realized I could do this instead. So we have the thing that the character was supposed to be doing, the thing that allowed them to not do that, and the thing they would rather do instead. So what they're supposed to do, or the expectations for them, what they did to escape them, what they'd rather do instead, and then the situation that they're in, which requires them to do the thing to some extent that they were supposed to do, the role that they're supposed to play. You get all of that, and in the way that you get it, you get the character's voice. You get how they feel about it. And so, even though this is science fiction, it's very much firmly placed in the genre. I'm going to pull up my chat box. I forgot to do this. All right, I'm going to pull that back up. Then I'm going to share this again. Oops. Share. All right. All right, a couple of questions. What's your opinion, first person versus third person in mystery novels? Whatever works. I think they tend to be first person, but they don't have to be. What's most important is that you get that voice. So if you're not going to have a first person voice, you're going to have a kind of a third person voice that's very, it's very sort of influenced or reflective of the community. You're going to have a sense of, here's how people might talk about it. Like that's very important. It cannot just be a generic voice. And there are some exceptions to that. There's a certain kind of like YA novel that has kind of does not have a very strong voice. And so you just want to make sure that you're sort of like doing what is, appropriate for your genre. How do you write dialogue? Again, I think dialogue is tied to voice. And so the same advice that I gave about, color commentary also applies to voice. So back in the Craig Johnson bit, when we got, his secretary / dispatcher telling him that, there was a dead body, like, she told him that in her voice. And then when she was forced to repeat herself, she didn't just say the same thing. You got a sense of her familiarity with having to repeat herself, also her frustration. And so whenever you're going to have a character speak, and in a mystery novel, they're going to be conveying pretty essential information, right? Like something about the crime, something about solving it. How do they how do they convey that essential information in their own particular way? And that's how you create voice, whether it's like the narration or dialogue. Whoops. I'm gonna move. Nope, that's not what I want either. I gotta move my chat box out of the way, move my picture out of the way. All right. Next. Which point of view will you choose to tell your story? Will you choose to tell your story? This is important, right? Because in any given like sort of world, there are multiple perspectives that you can select from, and the detective or the hero might not be the most obvious choice. And so, and the difference in terms of like who you select to have be your sort of like main character, the sort of voice of your novel, will make a big difference in terms of what that voice sounds like and how the story that they tell. So here's an example of a novel. This comes out in August, and I managed to get David Heska Wambi Wyden, who's Lakota from South Dakota. This novel is set on the Pinewood Reservation. And so in some ways, this novel has a lot in common with the Craig Johnson Longmire series. The setting is pretty like, it's a different Indian like tribe and nation in this novel than in the Longmire series. But I mean, there's a lot sort of overlap. In case of the crime itself is very similar. But the choice of narrator is completely different, and that's going to completely change the way that it's told. And so I reached out to David, who I don't know except for via social media, and said, hey, I really want to talk about this novel. Can you send me the first couple of pages? And so he sent me like the first few, and the first page is great, and you're going to get a very strong sense of voice, and you're going to see how different it is because of the POV choice that he made compared to Longmire. Let me move this over further. All right. I leaned back in the seat of my old Ford Pinto, listening to the sounds coming from the depot, the reservation's only tavern. There was a stream of Indians and white ranchers going inside. I knew Gov Yellowhawk was there with his buddies, pounding beers and drinking shots. Gov taught gym at the local school, football, basketball, soccer. But word was he sometimes got a little too involved with his students, both boys and girls. I was going to let him get good and drunk, then the real party would start. I had brass knuckles and a baseball bat stowed in my trunk, but those wouldn't be necessary. Gov was a fat-ass piece of shit and with a fry bread gut as big as a buffalo's ass. I'd been hired to beat the hell out of Gov by the father of a little girl at the school. Gov had sneaked up on the girl in the bathroom, held her down, and raped her. The girl's parents had confronted the school's principal, but Gov came from one of the most powerful families on the res, and the school refused to take any action. The principal had even threatened a lawsuit against the parents for making a false accusation. The tribal police couldn't do anything. The feds prosecuted all felony crimes on the res. They didn't mess with any crime short of murder. Now, the little girl was too scared to go back to her class, and he was free to molest other kids. I'd waived my fee for this job. Usually I charge $100 for each tooth I knocked out and each bone I broke, but I decided to kick Gov's ass for free. I'd hated him for, and then it goes on. So again, you get the setting, you get the characters, you get the crime that's about to happen, but it's not the same, even though the crime itself, or the crime that sort of like prompted this particular crime, is the exact same crime that happened in the first Longmire series book. And even like Gov Yellowhawk is a character who could have appeared in Longmire. The depot, there's a equivalent kind of like place in the Longmire book. But this perspective is totally different because it's an Indian narrator and not a white guy. And so you get both the sensibility Like he's able to talk about people he knows in his own way and from a place of close knowledge. But also you get like the kind of institutional knowledge about like which families are favored and how things are going to play out there, that is particular to this character that the white sheriff in this area might not know about or be as familiar with. And so what you can think of then is your point of view, in addition to giving you a voice, also gives you insight. Like what are the things that your character or that a point of view can give you access to that another point of view would not give you access to? And that access is a big reason why people read these kinds of novels, right? We want access into a particular element of police departments, or we want access into a particular, element of 12th century monastic life or whatever. And so ask yourself, not only what is the voice, but what is the kind of information that that voice can convey to the reader? And also, and this is very important, this first page gives you a lot of attitude. Like the end line about, usually I charge $100 for each tooth. That's what Rocky did in the first Rocky movie too. But like, this narrator's attitude is a little bit different than Rocky's about trying to break somebody's thumb. But he also decided to kick Gov's ass for free. Like, this is a fellow who likes the work that he does, and also, in this particular case, wants to commit it. He feels obliged to commit it. And so, again, think about like, what is your character's attitude toward what they do? In the Longmire series, the sheriff is kind of reluctant. In this series, or this first book, if it is indeed going to be the first in a series, there's no reluctance. The narrator is eager to do what he needs to do. All right, 2 more books. This next one is by Richard Santos, who is an Austin guy. He's great, and it's his first book. And one thing I want you to think about in terms of this page is this. What does everyone in your story understand about how the world works? So in almost every sort of mystery novel, there's the law, or there's rules, and then there's the way things actually work. And it's rare that they sort of line up. Even in the old school, old fashioned Hardy Boys books, which I've heard a lot of recently, the Hardy Boys, and sometimes with their father, they have to solve crimes sometimes against the wishes of the police department. And they sometimes do things that the police cannot do. So there's the law, and then there's the way the world works. And that's like, that difference is really important to build into your novel. And this also applies to reader expectations. There's the expectations that your readers have, and then there's the actual reality of your story. And if you can build a difference there, that's going to be really key to creating your voice. All right, so Richard's novel is Trust Me. It's a kind of political thriller with a real mystery aspect. It's set in New Mexico, where Richard's family is from. It comes out, I think, at the end of this month. You should absolutely check it out because it's incredibly entertaining. His book does not have a preview on Amazon yet. And so what I have done is grab a page that was excerpted somewhere on some blog, I forget where. But this is from like maybe the 2nd or 3rd chapter. But the what it does on that first page of that chapter is exactly what we've been talking about. So I'll read it and then we'll talk about it. All right. Hell of a week for Gabriel Luna. First, he was fired from a job he hated. Then he discovered his mean bastard of a father gave him bone cancer. Driving a dump truck on San Miguel Pueblo did not pay well, but it did pay. Gabe was helping to build Santa Fe's first major airport, and although the dust gave him headaches and he hated the hours and the heat, he occasionally felt something close to pride in the work. Then a bulldozer dug up a skeleton where there was not supposed to be a skeleton, and the whole site went to shit. A man with shiny shoes climbed onto the bed of a truck and with shaking hands clasped in front of his mouth sent everyone home. Gabe and the other laborers were given vague corporate assurances that the site would reopen after a swift investigation into the origin of the artifacts. He wasn't holding his breath. Holding his breath might be better than letting the bone cancer tunnel through his body. The same cancer had worn his father down to nothing but pain and sweat. Gabe would not go out that way. The diagnosis came from Shaman Jeff, whom Gabe called El Jefe. Wearing his customary blue Halliburton cap and smoking a cigarette, Jeff had said, "Yep, that's cancer to the core. Can damn near see it dripping from your nose." Gabe imagined his dying old man spitting bone cancer cells like pollen spores, special delivery aimed right at the son who was never there. Granted, no actual doctor had diagnosed him. Jeff's diagnosis came after poking a few lymph nodes and lighting a candle. But in 15 years, he had never steered Gabe wrong. The cancer was chewing on Gabe's bones, that was for sure. Now, a couple weeks after that 1-2 punch, Gabe pulled up in front of Jeff's trailer and killed his bike. Time for his second treatment. Now, again, you get the character, you get the place, you get the situation, but you also get the competing voices. And so there is the voice of the rule or the law, a swift investigation into the origin of the artifacts. And the speaker, all we get as a description of him is shiny shoes, shaking hands. That's the rule, that's the law. And then there's the way things work, which is all the workers know that this is not going to be swift. They kind of know the deal. He wasn't holding his breath. Whenever you can create that distance, that is excellent. That creates story. And then in terms of reader expectations, we get Shaman Jeff. If you think about a shaman, the first thing you're probably going to think of is not somebody wearing a blue Halliburton cap and smoking a cigarette. So then you have, you can play with that, right? You can introduce something that you think the readers will have expectations for, and then you can deliver that in a way that confounds those expectations. And then as you provide commentary about it, you can, that helps create the voice, knowing that distance. And a big part of writing a mystery novel, we think about plot and confounding reader expectations, but you can do that on a sort of like a granular sentence level in terms of describing a character or a place. Think about what your character expects and then don't give it to them in that way. And Richard's novel is full of that, in part because it's set in New Mexico, which is known as a land of enchantment. People think of mountains and sort of maybe like crystals if you're in Taos, or art if you're in Santa Fe. But it's a very weird place that is full of things that readers are not going to be familiar with. And so the opportunities afforded a writer by a New Mexico setting and by an intimate New Mexico setting are vast. All right. My last one that I want to talk about. I want to talk about, so far, we've mostly been talking about books in which the good guys and the bad guys have particular roles. And even if, in the case of the novel where the guy's going to go beat up somebody, like in one way he's the bad guy, but he's also sort of playing a role that has a lot of history, which is the good guy who does bad things in order to create justice. But there are some mystery novels and some crime novels where the role of good guy and bad guy is not so clear. And in fact, sometimes they have a very close relationship with one another. And so one thing you might think about then, depending on the kind of book that you want to write, can you confound or mix up the way that heroes and villains appear in your book? What if it's not clear who is who? And I'm going to slide this over because it's a quick question. How do you avoid making a bad guy two-dimensional? You know, that's a good question. And you can do various things to make them more complex, right? So you can give them a motivation. Like the old saying is that, antagonists think that they're the protagonists of their own story, right? So um, give them a reason for doing the things that they're going to do. The reason shouldn't just be, well, I need a bad guy for this story. But also, it's also the case that some villains are actually two-dimensional. But the thing is, they're so wonderful to watch that we don't care. And so, give them a motivation that's real and that exists outside your desire to write this book, but also give them a flair that makes them like just we want to watch them. Because if they're entertaining on the page, we don't like for a while we're not going to care how complex they are, and the complexity really will probably build itself as the novel goes forward. Now that said, this next book I'm going to talk about is full of complex characters, and it's kind of hard to pin them down. So let's take a look. All right. This next book is by John le Carre. You're familiar with him because he sold a bajillion books: Tinker, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, The Spy Who Came in from the Cold, the something Gardener, The Orchard Keeper. He's written a bunch of books. They've all sold a bajillion copies. This is just a book that I wasn't really familiar with. I picked it up at the local library. It's not one of his most famous ones, but even in this novel, he does the thing that he does so very well. So let's take a look. I'll just say that the thing that he does so very well is he's writing about espionage, sort of Cold War and after. And he was himself a British intelligence agent. And his perspective on that world is that the Western spies or the British spies were not really that much better than their Russian counterparts. And usually it was Russia, but not always. It's just not like the sides are not like you can't say good and bad, West versus East or whatever. And so in terms of who the good guy or the bad guy is, it's very hard to tell in his books. And you're going to see that early on. Let me get rid of this chat box so I can read my own thing. All right. This is the first page of this book. Larry went officially missing from the world on the second Monday of October at 10 minutes past 11 when he failed to deliver his opening lecture of the new academic year. I am able to set the scene exactly because it was not so very long ago, in the same dreary Bath weather, that I had dragged Larry down to see the wretched place for the first time. To this day, I have the most accusing memory of the brutalist slab barracks closing in on him like the walls of his new confinement, and of Larry's ever youthful back walking reproachfully away from me down the concrete canyon like a man going to his nemesis. If I had had a son, I thought as I stared after him, this is how it would feel to have him to be dumping him at his first boarding school. Hey, Timbo, he whispers over his shoulder the way Larry can speak to you from miles away. Yes, Larry? This is it, is it? This is what? The future, where it all ends, leftover life. It's a new beginning, I say loyally. But loyal to whom? To him, to me, to the office? We have to scale down, I say. Both of us do. And again, so we get the crime, first page. He's gone missing. We get the setting, like a drab university in a drab place in England. We get the main characters, Tim and Larry. But what's most important is this sense of almost like despair, of resignation, of a sense of like they're loyal because they're spies, right? But who are they loyal to? and what is the relationship to one another. Like, it's not, even though there was a crime missing, we don't yet know how to feel about it. We don't yet know who to cheer for. We don't yet know who really is going to, like, even if somebody solves the mystery, what does that mean in terms of who we want to win, who the good guy is. This is something that Le Carre does so very well in all of his books, and it determines the voice. The voice is not the same kind of voice that you would have in a Longmire novel. There's that sense of no clear sides, and therefore the stakes take on a different kind of like resonance. And so that's a really interesting thing to play with in your own book, is like how do the main characters feel about what they're doing? Do they feel that they're on the right side? And if they're not sure that they're on the right side, why do they continue to do the things that they're doing? That's a really wonderful thing to play with. So I'll leave you with that. Do I do character breakdowns? Yes. I think, and I say this as somebody who's written a couple of novels now. They're not out in print, but hopefully soon will be. But I do character breakdowns because, to some extent, like, I need to plan where I'm going. I have written blindly, which there can be some reward to, but it's also hard, right? And so I do character breakdowns just to get a sense for like their desires, their roles, and especially in a mystery novel, like you've got these sort of like, you've got the round hole to put the peg in, right? So like, where do your characters fit? And I think in terms of developing characters, I think you do it by figuring out what, like, so think about the Martha Wells novel, The Murderbot. You have a character who wants to do something, was designed to do something else, and is put in a situation where he has to do the thing that he doesn't want to do. That's how you develop characters, is by knowing those three things: what they're supposed to do, what they want to do, and the situation that makes them choose. And I think you outline, I personally am kind of a loose outliner. Some people outline very, very close. Like, they just sort of like sit down and they outline the whole thing and then they write it. There are other writers like Joe Lansdale and Sherry Thomas, who I've mentioned, who don't outline. What they do is they're always looking in every scene and every chapter for something that drives it forward. And so I think that you just, I think you find the way that works for you. Are you gonna be satisfied with knowing how everything's gonna play out and then writing it? Or do you want to discover it as you go? That if you're gonna do that, then you have to always have an eye toward like what is gonna complicate things next. What am I reading right now? Do I have a book rec for us? Well, actually, so all of these books are books that I'm reading right now. I'm not yet actually finished the Le Carre novel. So I would recommend anything by Le Carre. I would recommend Richard Santos's book, which is so good, and just a pleasure to read. And then two of the novels that I mentioned, Winter Counts. I would pre-order that one because it's going to be really good. I think he's going to be very much an up-and-coming writer. And then Martha Wells, her series, I think there's 4 or 5 novellas now. Read them, check them out, and then that way you can be ready for her novel that comes out in May. Also, apparently their audiobooks are really good. So thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure, and good luck with your writing.